So, Fields of Fire, middle of the afternoon in July when you guys signed up for this. How many of you thought this was an outdoor tour? Yeah, a few of you. Yeah, we've been dealing with that all week. But isn't it nice, air conditioning and how comfortable we are inside? First of all, thank all of you for coming. We really do appreciate it, particularly now with all the different things that are going on in Gettysburg. During anniversary week, we have Spaugy days here at the Adams County Historical Society. But in the old days, if you've been in town long enough, you only had one or two things to choose from, and now you have a lot to choose from. So the fact that you chose to be here does mean a lot to me, to Britt, to Phil, to Andrew, and to everybody involved. Okay, since the introductory bios took like 25 minutes, I'm going to dive right into this. The reason I'm going first, and the reason we've chosen the order that we've chosen, is try to envision the Emmitsburg Road Ridge in your mind's eye right now, and we're literally going to work our way down the road. So I'm going to start at Sherfy, Britt goes next with Klingel, and then Phil goes last with Rogers. I kind of have the easy part because I have the house and the property that is in the, trying to get my laser pointer here. I have the house and the property. I think we turned this off. Hold that. I have the house and the property that's still in the best case of preservation, so I sort of have the easiest job to do today. But first and foremost, before I get started, do we have any Sherfy, Klingel, Rogers descendants in the audience tonight? Particularly when you do something here, you never know, so. Okay, not a single hand went up. All right, that kills that reference, so let's get right into the battle. All right. The Emmitsburg Road Ridge, the kind of the star of our show today, and very much, minus the monuments, something of a view that Union General Daniel Edgar Sickles might have enjoyed on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, before, of course, we all know he made his momentous move forward to that Emmitsburg Road. Couple comments I want to make here, and I know there's a lot of text here. I'm just going to highlight a few things. Some comments that I pulled from the National Military Parks Cultural Landscape Report, now dated 2002, so although it's 20 plus years old, some of the most succinct descriptions of the Emmitsburg Road Ridge as a battle landmark that I personally have ever read, and it's sort of summarizing what we're going to talk about today. Emmitsburg Road Ridge, it runs across the middle of the July 2nd and July 3rd battlefield. It coincides with the Emmitsburg Road through the Sherfy farm, through the Klingel farm, before crossing to the west side of the road near the Spangler farm. Well, we're not doing Spangler today. However, they mentioned in that the eastern slope of the ridge was used as cover and concealment by infantry and artillery of the 3rd Corps. General Sickles perceived this ridge as key terrain and moved his 3rd Corps forward from his assigned position on Cemetery Ridge, July 2nd. He sought to improve his observation of enemy movements and positions to prevent Confederate artillery from securing the position and dominating his former battle line. Look, if you've ever done terrain assessment or when we try to assess the value of these positions on the battlefield, man, it covered a lot of key points right there. Sickles considered it key terrain. It was used as cover and concealment, observation, good positions for movements and for artillery, and fields of fire down here. And of course, July 3rd, Confederate artillery used that same ridge to direct fire eastward against the Union line along Cemetery Ridge. Ultimately, as we know, unsuccessfully, but they didn't know that at the time the decision was made. All of these features that I just highlighted help highlight the importance of the Emmitsburg Road as a key battle landmark. But a lot of the things that attract armies attract people. Now, obviously, when farmers come and they build their home, they're not thinking about where they're going to place their artillery and stuff like that. But broad open fields, roads, things of that nature. And so let's meet the guy that I'm going to focus on today, Joseph Sherfy, and his family, and let's bring him sort of onto that same landmark. Joseph Sherfy was 51 years old in 1863. He had been married in 1840. By the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, he had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, basically ranging in age from born in 1843, which would have made Raphael the oldest about 20, down to 3 years old. So you got that wide range of kids in there, also sharing the house with his mother-in-law. So all in, you got something like 9 people living in the Sherfy house at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. I might imagine Joseph was looking for an excuse to get out of the house for the day. Now, if you recall, where was Joseph Sherfy born? Some of you know this, I know. Where was Joseph Sherfy born? Yeah, in what we call today the Rose Farm. So the guy didn't move very far during the course of his life. He acquired the land that we call the Sherfy Farm today from his father Jacob, before Jacob died in 42. The brick farmhouse that we know today as the Sherfy farmhouse was built about the same time, 1842, 43. The Sherfys were very well regarded in the community, and this is kind of a new thing for me. You know, I talk about Sickles a lot and all of his vices and everything he was into. I talk about Custer a lot, and people don't like Custer and all of that stuff. So to actually talk about a nice guy is sometimes a little bit of unfettered territory for me. But Joseph Sherfy and the whole Sherfy family, as I said, very highly regarded in the Gettysburg community. Joseph was in addition to farming peaches, was a deacon in the German Baptist Brethren Church, and by 1853 he had made minister. His sermons were regarded as practical and well regarded, but as I alluded to earlier, you know, he's supplementing his living in a number of different ways, and that included being a fruit dealer. Now these boundaries here mark what would roughly be the 50-acre Sherfy farm as it looked in 1863. You can see the house and the barn here. The peach orchard, as it's marked out today by Gettysburg National Military Park, was a older yet smaller peach orchard that sat on the Sherfy property, about 4 acres. That's what we interpret today as the peach orchard. But they also had a newer peach orchard of about additional 6 acres that stretched across the Wheatfield Road and ran in the field opposite where the Sherfy property is today. They had a $3,000 real estate value in the 1860s. That was considered fairly well prosperous for the time and for the county. And the other thing too, which again would attract the armies on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, as I alluded to earlier, the broad, flat Emmitsburg Road ridge. Now, this is what peach trees look like. I don't have a date on that, probably I would guess 1880s. It is post-war. One of the things that kind of drives me bonkers on battlefield tours is when people will stop my Sickles monologue and ask me, like, what kind of peaches were they during the time of the battle? As far as I can tell, they were, from the records I've seen from Gettysburg National Military Park, the answer is Red Haven peaches. Now, they're Messina today, and if I'm wrong on that, I kind of don't care, but, you know, peaches are peaches, but as I understand, they were Red Haven at the time, and I feel like I can now check that box with a clear conscience. But if you wanted to know what the orchard might have looked like back in the days gone by, that again is a late 19th century image of that. It's really the Emmitsburg Road. You know, we focus as battlefield guides, as historians, as interpreters, we focus on the peach orchard. Really, the key was the Emmitsburg Road. It was a very conveniently located position, you know, literally one of the 10 roads that comes into and out of Gettysburg. And this would be a post-1889 image of that part of the battlefield. I like the image because it kind of gives you a sense of what the Emmitsburg Road looked like on that part of the field before, obviously, it became the paved super highway that it is today. It was a key location. And one of the things that always attracted me to this, believe it or not, more than Dan Sickles, was just the idea of, in a lot of ways, this is a who's who of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia during the course of those early days of July 1863. John Buford passed by here, John Reynolds, Oliver Howard, Joshua Chamberlain, who we're going to see later, Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, George Pickett, and guys like Dan Sickles. So a lot of who's who, a lot of prominent names would have passed by here. And on July 1st, 1863, there are stories of Joseph Sherfy's wife, Mary, out here at the road at the well, probably with her mother and maybe with some of the daughters, literally supplying water to the troops as they passed by. Morning of July 1st, 1863, during literally his last moments on Earth, John Reynolds in the 1st Corps would have come through here, and then later that day would have been Oliver Howard in the 11th Corps, and then later that day to mop up the victory would have been Dan Sickles in the 3rd Corps. But all of these guys coming through on the 1st, and Mary Sherfy probably supplied as much water as she could until the well ran dry. Another image again from roughly that period. As I said, again, I like it because of the rutted nature of the Emmitsburg Road in the foreground before it was what it was today. And note, of course, the fences along the road itself. Skirmishing took hold on the property evening of July 1st and well into the morning and afternoon of July 2nd before the major combat started. Mary's mother, Catherine Hegan, Grandmother Hegan as they sometimes called her, had what was called a thrilling experience that morning. While skirmishing was going on, zip, zip, back and forth across the property, Grandmother Hegan was standing by one of these fences watching the action, and a Confederate ball came through one of the planks in the fence, probably slowed down its velocity a little bit from the plank, but then sort of stopped itself in the folds of her dress and saved her from injury. And again, I'll tell you, I had somebody on tour fairly recently who said, "That's not true, Jim. She didn't wear a big dress like that." Well, that's what the family history says. That's what they said happened. But seeing that, one of the Union officers on the skirmish line basically said, "Okay, folks, you got to get out of here." And so by about 10:30 in the morning on July 2nd, according to Mr. Sherfy, as U.S. skirmishers were approaching from the east side and the Confederates were occupying Pitzer's Woods on the west side, 10:30 in the morning, July 2nd, was when the family left the property. You can only imagine, right? I mean, imagine you're leaving your home, your farm, your property behind, and the two largest armies on the planet at that time, or certainly at least in North America at that time, are occupying the east and the west end of the property. Now, of course, the property was immortalized, by Dan Sickles' occupation of the Sherfy Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, but then later that day by William Barksdale's attack through the property and what has been termed by some the most magnificent charge of the war. And you can see in this image, they try to show Barksdale's men crashing through. This is the Sherfy house over here, the barn, and the Zouaves of the 114th Pennsylvania. So as close as we can get to trying to envision what the heart of that combat would have looked like on the afternoon of July 2nd. Oops, give me a second there. Now, as a modern map, this gives you an idea of sort of what the movements through the Sherfy property might have looked like. So down here, we have some of the Union positioning in the peach orchard, and I'm guessing most of you know this. I'm not going to dwell on it too heavily, but for those who may not, 3rd Corps troops here at the southern end of the peach orchard, in and along the Emmitsburg Road, the Sherfy house and barn up here, and some of that action I showed you in the last slide with Barksdale's guys crashing through the property would have occurred here literally along the Emmitsburg Road itself. The point that I'll make, without getting into the nuts and the bolts and the nitty-gritty of all the different combat that was out here, the point, and we made it in our book, is if you think about it, from the peach orchard up here through the Trussell Lane until you start to transition into the Klingel property, during the Battle of Gettysburg, about 5,000 people fought on Joseph Sherfy's farm. 5,000. And we got like 100, supposedly we have like over 100 in here today. But imagine what that would have been like. 5,000 people coming across the property back and forth during these various actions. And we estimated of all the ones that were out here, Union and Confederate total, probably about 2,300 casualties, about a 45% casualty rate. So not only did 5,000 people fight on this property, but almost 1 out of every 2 was killed, wounded, missing, or captured. And even Barksdale, the most magnificent charge of the war. And I get in trouble with Southern listeners on our podcast when I say stuff like this, but even Barksdale's so-called most magnificent charge of the war, 49% casualties. That's what you call victory in the Civil War, only 49% casualties. So heavy losses on both sides. We all know ultimately Union forces were driven off the Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard. And although not represented on this map, as I alluded to on an earlier slide though, what is important to remember is when you get into July 3rd, Robert E. Lee ordered under James Longstreet ordered basically Confederate artillery to be placed along this ridge line of the Emmitsburg Road, working its way all the way from what we know today as the Peach Orchard, across through Klingel, and continuing on towards where the Virginia Memorial is today. And it was an important artillery position during July 3rd, what we know as Pickett's Charge. So I want to highlight for people, not only is it the fighting on July 2nd, but it was the Confederate victory on July 3rd that convinced Robert E. Lee to launch the most disastrous of attacks, Pickett's Charge. And again, it happens in large part on this property. A lot of personal stories related with it. Probably my favorite story, and one of the reasons why the Sherfy house always appealed to me, was during the course of the combat here, there was actual fighting in the house. Some of the properties on the battlefield today witnessed fighting. Some of them served as field hospitals. Properties like this appeal to me where you actually have combat in the house, because during this phase, you had a squad of probably maybe about as many as 50 guys or so fighting in and around the Sherfy buildings itself. You know, you would have had a house, a barn, outbuildings, and that sort of thing. But from the 57th Pennsylvania, there was probably a squad of at least 15 men in the house itself, firing from the windows of the house. And when Barksdale was overrunning the position, the colonel of the 57th Pennsylvania, seeing support crumbling all around him, the colonel of the 57th Pennsylvania basically ordered his regiment to fall back. And one of my unsung heroes at the Battle of Gettysburg, the 57th's one of the captains, Allenson Nelson, basically went to the colonel and said, "We can't pull back yet. We have guys in that house." And in the best military tradition, the colonel said, "I'll take care of the regiment, Captain. You go in the house and take care of those guys." So as the 57th was starting to pull back, Captain Nelson did his part, and he dashed into the house, went up to the stairs. Again, guys are shooting out the windows. It's so loud in there. Nelson said, "I literally had to shout into their ears to try to get them to understand. I'm pulling them away from the windows, anything I could to get them out of the house." And as Nelson did his duty upstairs, he came down the stairs, looked out one of the windows, and to his shock and horror, saw the yard filled with Confederate soldiers. Well, you can imagine probably the shouts and cries of "Surrender, you damn Yankee," probably echoed throughout the yard. And Nelson at that point burst through the front door, did the 100-yard dash back to Cemetery Ridge, and avoided capture. But he did regret he wasn't able to get everyone from the regiment off the property. And maybe as many as 50 members of the regiment were captured on the Sherfy property, and many of them died in Confederate captivity, lasting casualties of the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's a story that's always spoke to me, and if you've ever wondered why is there so much bullet damage in and around the house, one of the reasons is there was actual fighting there. Okay, recognize this guy? As the armies pull back, another sort of my who's who of the Sherfy farm, people often don't know this aspect of it. The 20th Maine camped and bivouacked on the Sherfy property on July 5th. So as the Confederates are pulling back to the west and the Union is moving to the west, the Army of the Potomac's moving to the west, slowly, cautiously pursuing them, coming off of the Round Tops was the 20th Maine, and they spent some time bivouacked in the Sherfy yard. And guess what Joshua Chamberlain did? He had all the fences torn down for barricades. So like imagine Chamberlain kind of like vandalizing the Sherfy yard. And that's going to come back later in the damage claim. But one of the things that had happened prior to that was on July 3rd, and probably many of you know the story, but on July 3rd, the Sherfy's prized barn had been set on fire by an errant artillery shell, and many wounded soldiers who were in the barn at that time, including many of the 114th Pennsylvania Zouaves who were in that barn and were wounded and could not get out when it got set on fire, got burned alive. And many soldiers from these regiments who came back here for reunions afterwards and that sort of thing talked about at some of these speeches that one of the most gruesome things any of them had ever witnessed on any battlefield was the sight of their burned comrades in Joseph Sherfy's barn. And Joshua Chamberlain writes about this in one of his books. He says, as the regiment came out here, there lay the remnants, too terrible to describe, of officers and men, rebel and Union, half burned or with roasted heads. A number of them being shot through the head, but still breathing after 24 hours. We tried to do something for them, but they were past all human aid. I hold back rather than attempt to describe this scene. And I don't say this flippantly. I know it's going to sound kind of flippant, but think about how bad it must have been to leave Joshua Chamberlain, of all people, speechless. Right? And that's, and that was, he said, I'm going to hold back and not describe this. Others in the 20th Maine described the scene as well. I know Ellis Spear did too. As we said before, the Sherfy family had left during the fighting. They were ordered away on the morning of July 2nd. By the, I don't know, the 6th, 7th, 8th or so, they're starting to come back. But also now, with word of this great battle at Gettysburg, other people in the region are starting to come around and see what's going on up at Gettysburg. We have a journal entry from a man who visited the property on July 7th, and he describes this. We came to what was once Joseph Sherfy's peach orchard. The house was terribly used up by shell. He talks about the northwest corner being smashed by a shell. One had stuck a burrow. The rebels had searched the house thoroughly for feather beds never used, were soaked with blood and bloody clothes, and filth of every description was strewn through the house. So not only did you have the battle damage, whether it was used as a Confederate aid station or whatever on July 3rd, you had just filth and all kinds of stuff scattered throughout the house. As I always try to remind people on tours, and I know some people like modern analogies and some don't, but as a reminder, this isn't the day when you could go to Target or Walmart and just buy, or Amazon, just rebuy all of your stuff, those feather beds that had never been used. It was going to take the Sherfys a long time to rebuild and get their act together. Before I go on to this slide, though, if there's something I like about the Sherfys, though, is they did it. They persevered. And Joseph Sherfy rebuilt his peach canning business. He would, in later years, literally can the peaches from the Gettysburg battlefield, So we people today, we don't have the market cornered on trying to capitalize on the battle. This literally goes back to the people who lived through it. But another thing they had on the property was these large cherry trees on the north side of the house. The cherry trees had reportedly dated back to a prior owner from the mid to late 1700s. And another evidence of damage was that at least in one of the trees, a large solid shot was embedded. And this was a popular landmark for many years. People would look at the damage on the property and come look at the cannonball in the Sherfy tree. Now, of course, these trees are long gone. Where's this solid shot on display today? Again, supposedly we have it here downstairs. So I would encourage you to take a look at it as you walk through the museum on your way out tonight. And of course, you had dead humans and animals all in and around the property. So this is a snapshot of the famous Elliott burial map. Again, the Elliott burial map was plotted to basically mark large mass graves and such that were on properties and farms scattered all across the Gettysburg battlefield. Here, you can see me highlighting, here's the Sherfy property. And one of the things that Britt and I learned when we did our peach orchard book, because I don't think we really knew or were expecting to find this, if you look at the Elliott map, the biggest concentration of bodies on the Sherfy property are not necessarily in and around what is blocked off as the traditional peach orchard today. In fact, there are very few of them. But as you move up Up the road here, and you get closer to the Sherfy house and what I sometimes call Wentz's Field. That area right across from the Sherfy house actually had a much heavier concentration of dead bodies, Union and Confederate, and as well as dead horses and such on the property as well. So again, using the Elliott map, and we can quibble about the numbers, and we do quibble about the numbers, at least 4 mass graves were plotted right in and around the Sherfy house itself, and in total, maybe as many as 100 corpses were in this general area, and that doesn't even include the horses, just talking about the people. So the house is trashed, you got blood, gore all over the place, and you have dead bodies literally all over their property. This is a copy of their damage claim. Now, you can't really read it, right? But the barn was burnt. That was $1,000. That was the biggest loss. The barn was the biggest loss, $1,000. Damage to fruit trees totaled about $180, and Joshua Chamberlain's fences cost $140, and you can kind of work your way all down the list here. They filed a damage claim for about $2,466. Now, if you go to a traditional inflation calculator, 1863 to 2025, you basically want to multiply $1,863 times 25. So 2466, if I did that math right, 2466 times 25 should be about $63,000 today. That's only got to tell a part of the story, because I don't care what the inflation calculator says. There's no way you're rebuilding the Sherfy barn today for, anything less than $63,000. So it was a lot of money by 1860s standards. They talked about the loss of fencing and growing crops. The rails were used by the Union Army in throwing up breastworks. The Union troops under Colonel Chamberlain occupied the place and threw up breastworks. So they literally blamed Chamberlain in the damage claim for destroying the fences. Now, some of you might know the story. If you don't know the story, it's kind of on screen right now. But what did they do? 20 years. 20 years you fought the damage claim. You put together attestations with the government. 20 years, and in 1883, the claim was rejected, and they didn't get anything for it. And so if there's a moral of the story, right, government was screwing you in 1883, it'll screw you in 2025. Again, there's just some things that are universal, and that would be one of them. The other thing, too, and this is just sort of a non-battle sidelight, but might be interesting to some people. So the barn as it stands today is not the one that was built immediately afterwards as the replacement barn. The replacement barn burned down again in July of 1866. There was an article in the paper here, which we can see, before daylight on the morning of July 4th, with the barn, and it said the barn had been erected the prior year. So it looks like they probably had the replacement barn up by 1865, but by summer of 66, it looks like chicken thieves accidentally burned it down again. And so they had to rebuild it again. Go back to what I said on the last slide. They were still in the process of fighting their damage claim with the government at that time. So now you're adding this to your plate as well. And I would note, the paper said, Mr. Sherfy is one of the most inoffensive citizens. He has the sympathies of the entire community, and I believe they even did kind of pass a plate, so to speak, to kind of get him to try to help him out and pay for it. So the barn that is up today is at least the third one to be on the property. Now, by 1869, survivors are coming back. Thompson's Battery, if you ever wanted to know, August of 69, Thompson's Battery is the first to officially mark their position in the peach orchard. By the mid-1890s, they would have had about more than 24 or so monuments in the area of the peach orchard. The Sherfys stayed on the property through much of this era, but more and more people are coming, tourists, right? That we love them, we hate them, bane of our community, right? Tourists were coming and trampling through the property, and it was becoming harder and harder for the Sherfys to make a living just from their fruit and just from their peaches. So eventually they left. By somewhere in that 1905 to 1910 era was when the War Department acquired more than 50 acres around the site of the peach orchard. Joseph Sherfy, he died in 1882 before that damage claim was accepted. 70 years old at the time. He died at home of malarial typhoid fever. I'm going to tell a quick story here. It's the only kind of creepy battlefield experience I've ever had. Many years ago, I got a call from the Gettysburg Foundation. Somebody said, hey, we have Sherfy descendants in town. Would you come and show them around? I said, sure. So I went over there, and we were sitting in the kitchen table of the Sherfy house, and I was talking to these descendants, and one of the things I just happened to say was, well, did you know Joseph Sherfy died in this house? And the woman said, oh, no, that's interesting. Do you know when he died? And, I didn't have that date memorized, so we looked it up, and the date was October 2nd, and it was October 2nd when we were in the house having that conversation. It's the only creepy experience I've ever personally had at Gettysburg. Funeral largely attended, and really tragically though, within a few weeks of his father's death, oldest son Raphael contracted the same disease and he died at 39 years old on November 18th. So that was a real tragedy for the family to lose Joseph and their oldest son. Mrs. Sherfy, though, went on for a number of years. She was very popular with the veterans. The veterans would come. She'd show them the property. She'd show them that cannonball in the tree, talk about stories about ammunition chests being found along the Emmitsburg Road, which they thought might still be buried there. She also collected images of the men that once fought across her property. And I know my two collector buddies would love to come across Mrs. Sherfy's photo collection, but I don't believe that's ever turned up in this world or any other. She finally died in 1904 at the age of 87 years old. And once again, her gentle manners, her kindness, her goodness of life endeared her to the whole community. And the community mourned her as they mourned her husband. But of course, the battle went on. Preservation, right? Stuckey's is always a crowd pleaser. I work this into every Sherfy presentation that I can. Stuckey's and Texaco. There's Texaco over here. The Twin Kiss snack bar all stood on the site from the mid-1950s until the early 1970s. How many of us locals remember the Stuckey's? Good number of hands go up. Did you eat there? Yeah, I don't think so, but you remember it, right? So the battle will always go on. Kind of ironic, the Sherfys survived the Battle of Gettysburg, but ultimately they lost their property to preservation and for a while commercialization. But at least we can say we're glad that we no longer have that on the property. The house, as we said, still stands with remnants of battle damage, beautifully maintained and managed by the Gettysburg Foundation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Britt as we now are going to move up the road to their neighbors at the Klingel property. Thank you all. We're going to do questions at the end, so we'll just kind of hold that. And Andrew's coming up here. Is there a technical thing we got to do? Oh yeah, we're going to change the files here, so give us a minute on that.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm always told I'm too loud, so my apologies in advance. I'm going to pull my notes out and keep my phone here so that I don't drive Phil from the field. But we're going to continue the move northward. And, of course, I have the privilege of talking about the Klingel farm, which, for those of you that have driven down the Emmitsburg Road recently, does not look nearly as good as you see in the photo on the screen. This was taken 7 years ago, and of course, it's suffering from some major deterioration that we'll talk about in just a little while here. But just to give you a little background history on the property as we move further to the north, and this actually includes all three farms that we're discussing today. This property was all part of William Penn's Manor of Mask going back to 1681. The first known owner of the property out there on the Emmitsburg Road Ridge that included Klingel belonged to a gentleman named John McFerrin, who actually owned about 70 acres. That dates back to 1741. And the Klingel house itself, I'm going to forward this. The Klingel house itself is actually built in 1828 by a gentleman named Ludwig Essig. Yes, he's a European immigrant. We know that he had been on the property as early as 1810, and we're uncertain, unfortunately, about what structures may have existed there before. In fact, when I had the privilege of beginning to do a deep dive on the Klingel farm, I learned very quickly just how much we don't know about this property, which is a great and a terrible thing, right? Because, you know, you have a lot of questions to answer, but I would highlight that my experience over the last about 8 months in close proximity to the project that the National Park Service has undertaken has been one of complete wonder for the Gettysburg community, the Adams County community. In fact, it was Jim who invited me here to this very spot to spend 5 minutes talking to the the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable about the Klingel project, and it just so happened there were folks in the audience that day with connections to the story of this farm. And slowly, over the course of the beginning of the year, we've begun to unravel some pretty awesome resources, which I will share with you as we move along. Just know this, Ludwig Essig, he started with 3 acres, and by the time he builds what we know of as the Klingel House in 1828, his empire had grown to 19 acres, and he had a family, 2 children, 2 to 3 cows, 1 horse, depending on which year in the agricultural reports you look at, and he was earning about $50 per year as a farmer. Now, as it would happen, his wife, Catherine, actually has the last name of Trossel before their marriage. They're in close proximity. So the good news for Ludwig is that although the farming was not prosperous in any way, shape, or form in the lead up to the Civil War, if you look back at the records, it's pretty fascinating. He just starts swapping tracts and acreage with Catherine's family, the Trossels, to make up for the tax deficits that he's suffering from. And so depending on when you look, the size of that farm is actually between 3 and 19 acres during the build-up to the Civil War. By 1860, things had gone south in a hurry, and he is actually going to be forced to sell the farm to a local attorney named Jacob Benner. And Benner is eventually going to sell this farm in April of 1863, just months before the battle will come here to Gettysburg, to Daniel Klingel and his wife, Hannah. So let me give you a few words on what we know of the Klingels. So Daniel hailed from a German family. Not surprisingly, a lot of the families in this vicinity were from German background. His father actually from Bavaria. He was a cobbler, a boot and shoemaker. And Hannah, his wife, actually bears the last name of Hege. Sound familiar from Jim's presentation? That was Grandma Hege. So there is a familial tie there. This is the other thing, is you unspin this web, just how closely interwoven all of these families are. By the time of the battle in 1863, they have 2 children. They've got a 2-year-old and they've got a 4-month-old. And they had largely evaded having to participate in any way, shape, or form in the conflict. I'm going to pick this up. So, being from Mount Joy Township, Daniel's roots are here. We know that at the time of the battle, he is farming a total of 15 acres. That's what it was sold at from Benner. And there really is not a lot of information outside of a damage claim report about what their experience was like during the battle. So we're going to zoom in and zoom out to piggyback off of Jim's presentation, talk very briefly about the action, just to provide an overview. But the one thing that we do have is a National Tribune report in the weeks after the battle where a correspondent actually interviewed Daniel Klingel. And Klingel mentions, and this is a head-scratcher sort of, that on July 1st, 1863, the family is still in the house. And that evening, between 14 and 16 Confederate wounded soldiers are brought to their house. Daniel and Hannah will escort them into the downstairs. If you go out there and look at the footprint of this building, it's 27 by 12. It's not huge. So that number of wounded soldiers probably takes up the majority of the downstairs floor, while the family remains upstairs. And he mentions to this correspondent that they will attend to their wounds, bathe the wounds, through the night of July the 1st. On July 2nd, at the insistence of Union officers, the Klingels will finally depart. We'll pick up their story on the other side of the action. So, moving north up the Emmitsburg Road, here's Sherfy, here's Klingel. As Barksdale's brigade begins to swing from heading west to east to south to north up the Emmitsburg Road, of course, there's a big problem for Andrew Atkinson Humphrey's division of the 3rd Corps, which is stationed around the Klingel farm and points north. Actually, at the behest of Division Commander David Balburney, Humphreys is going to order his left to be thrown back and refused. And the dubious honor for that maneuver is the Excelsior Brigade under William Brewster. Now, I also have to mention this because Jim pulled up a great photo, and it's July 2nd, 2025. It's the anniversary of the battle. I cannot go an anniversary date with talking about the greatest regiment that ever served in either army, the 105th Pennsylvania Wildcats. So, you can see why I chose this map, because there they are holding out with the rest of Graham's battered brigade. In the words of Calvin Augustus Craig, in the face of this action of the greatest charge ever made by Barksdale's men, he claims they will reform 8 to 10 times in a fighting withdrawal back across the fields towards Cemetery Ridge. The most significant of those that the soldiers will write about is right here in the Trossel Farm Lane. Lieutenant Robert Boynton of Company I would say, the bullets never flew faster. And at one point, I was hit so hard I believed I was struck by a cannonball, and was relieved to look and find that it was only a mini ball that had gone through my thigh. Only a mini ball. But the fighting is fierce. In this melee, as Brewster is reforming the rest of the brigade to refuse the line, you'll notice that one regiment is on this map. This is actually their second fight of the day. The 73rd New York had already been pulled up here into the Sherfy's other orchard. And they were actually led by Henry Tremaine. And he wrote afterwards, it was like putting a peanut into a stone crusher. Again, just if you didn't get enough from what Jim said, in this small area, this is some of the most brutal action of the entire Battle of Gettysburg. So we'll continue on here. And of course, I was afraid that Jim might not have a picture with the 105th Monument in his presentation, so I just included that. But of course, it's Brigadier General Billy Fixen's Cadmus Wilcox, who is leading his Alabamans actually across the fields in the foreground here. I like this photo because when we talk about understanding the landscape as we're out there, yes, this is the greatest regiment that ever fought on either side, but it's a nice landmark to know where the Trossel Farm Lane was at when you're looking across the field from the Confederate perspective. So Barksdale's guys by this point are actually moving from our right to left, as Wilcox's guys are moving straight across this field towards the ridge. They've got them enfiladed. Now, the other thing to clear up here very quickly, and this is from the other side. Of course, you can see the Klingel farm sticking out right in the middle, the white log cabin with the barn and the outbuildings, is that what most people believe when they first come to Gettysburg of Excelsior Field, as it's called in a lot of histories, could not be further off. Excelsior Field, where Brewster is going to reform his men, is actually right out here, downslope of today where the 120th New York Monument exists. I bring this up because one of the things that Jim and I, as we were working on the book, talked a fair amount about, and with some colleagues, is how or how little information there is about the Excelsior Brigade and their participation in this battle. When you look at the casualties that they suffer, over 42% of the brigade is eaten up that afternoon. And, you know, depending on what source you look at, there are claims that, well, they didn't fight too much, they didn't fight too long. 42% casualties. 800 out of the 1,800 men that they brought to the field disappear, and most of those casualties are suffered right here on the east slope of the Emmitsburg Road Ridge behind the Klingel farm. Of course, as you know, eventually they are going to break. To give you an idea of how many artillery shells were hitting the ground, Lieutenant Aaron Seeley, who had 6 guns right up there at the top of the ridge in the action that day, would write afterwards, "Orders came to change the position of the battery, to what point I cannot now recollect. But by then I was very weak." He had already been shot through the chest. "And faint from loss of blood. I was unable to mount my horse. I was carried to the rear by 2 infantry soldiers. While being so carried over the ground on an open plain between the orchard and the heights in the rear, I observed that the ground was completely scoured by the projectiles from the Confederate artillery. Shells were screaming through the air and bursting in every direction." So this kind of shows you the aftermath as the line crumbles and what I described to you as Excelsior Field. Now again, there are going to be different units in this mass that will begin to reform in different places as they withdraw back towards Cemetery Ridge. You can see Seeley's battery getting out of there. And then, of course, it's General Carr's brigade that is going to take the heat as Wilcox's brigade gets across the field. I'd be remiss to mention Lang's Florida Brigade also joining on their flank, but I'm not going to go into any crazy detail on that because, as you can see by the map, they're headed straight for the Rogers farm. So the other key piece to this, every presentation I do has to have a poem. So here it is. This is one of my favorite on the battlefield, the 12th New Hampshire, another unit that suffers 42% casualties in their actions that day. Their monument is just to the north of the Klingel farm. On the monument, "Our union is river, lake, ocean, and sky. Man breaks not the metal when God cuts the die." Those good granite staters. But going back to something that Jim alluded to earlier, just want to point out, talking about the artillery platform that was the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, of course, that extends all the way up towards the Klingel farm. You've got Taylor's Battery in the orchard just south of the house. One of the few things that does make it to the damage claim that the Klingels will file afterwards is the shell fragments and the unburst shells that they found around the property, which is pretty interesting. Now, of course, Wilcox's and Lang's brigade, as most of you know well, are going to trot over this very same ground on July 3rd as they move towards Cemetery Ridge and that famous attack that we know of as Pickett's Charge. And you all know the outcome of that. So Klingel Farm is right in the center of all of this melee on both July 2nd and July 3rd. In the damage claim that's filed after the battle by Daniel, he will mention that damage was done to all of the buildings. The chinking was knocked out between all of the logs of the house. And he even identifies by some Massachusetts men. I don't know where he got that from, but it's in there. All the glass was broken. Damage was done to the fruit trees. He doesn't spell out how much damage. Rifle pits were dug around them as well. This is another little interesting detail. I don't believe they're rifle pits. I think they're probably redans around the guns that were placed there by Confederates late on July 2nd, early morning hours of July 3rd. He also mentions they lost a cow. 3.5 acres of corn were completely destroyed. 3.5 acres of oats were completely destroyed. 2 acres of timothy grass were completely destroyed. By my count, that's 9 acres out of the 15 that they have. And 4 of those acres were an orchard. So virtually the entire property, economically speaking, was brought to its knees. We lost several worm fences, a post fence, boards and pickets. The house was used as a surrogate hospital, and when they returned on July 5th, it was still filled with wounded men. At least one soldier was buried in the front yard, and there were others just laying above the surface on the property. Not the 100 that the Sherfy farm has in their claims, but significant damage for this young family. Now, the other thing I would like to mention is, of course, to this day in 2025, as Americans, we all are forced to endure difficult circumstances in different moments in our lives, whether it's from a natural disaster or whether it's the air conditioning going out last week for 6 days. That sucked. I'm just kidding. It's fine. It's fine. It wasn't so bad. But life is not so bad when we look back at what occurred all those years ago. And of course, I think, I'll say this for myself personally, this is how we connect to these stories. This is the human experience that we all share, right? And, you know, unlike in all of the movies, whether it's Gettysburg or Glory, there's always somehow a happy ending in the Civil War movies that have ever been made, because of what it means for the nation, because of what it means for the human experience. Well, the Klingels had no such luck. They are also not going to receive a dime for the damages done to their property. The little one, who was only a few months old at the time of the battle, is dead by October. And in fact, there were deaths that preceded that. On July 20th, 1863, 17 days after the guns go silent here at Gettysburg, Daniel finds out that his younger brother, 19 years old, Albert, had died down in Suffolk with 165th Pennsylvania. They're going to try to have more children, and it's a losing effort. John Elmer Ellsworth was born on May 8th, 1864, and he's dead by August 22nd. One can only wonder, none of this is recounted in the primary source material, but in any event, in September of 1864, Daniel is going to be compelled to enlist in Company G of the 209th Pennsylvania. He'll serve through March on a number of fields around Petersburg during that campaign, and is eventually discharged because of his own disease, typhus. He knew there's another child on the way, and she was born in May of 1865, Sarah, but she dies in October. The one bright spot is a little boy who comes in 1866 as they're trying to rebuild their farm, and Charles will fortunately live until 1927. We don't know the why of this, and you know, when you look at the little bit of scant evidence we have, by 1866, the Klingels too had done their best to rebuild their farm, their lifestyle. But in October of that year, they will put the farm on the market for sale. And it doesn't sell until mid-1867. It goes to a gentleman named Joseph J. Smith. Klingel's wife dies later that year. He remarries, has 2 more children. One of them will live to adulthood. Many of the family members are buried in Evergreen Cemetery, a few in other local cemeteries. In total, Daniel and Hannah had 6 kids, only 2 of them surviving. And with his second wife, Daniel has 2 children, one of them that survives. Now, because of this trajectory in the sales of the property, Joseph Smith, by 1887, is going to sell the Klingel farm to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. It is, in fact, one of the earliest properties to end up with that preservation organization. And we get some views of this through the years. Of course, all of you have seen the series of photos, one of which I have up on the screen. These were taken by famed Gettysburg photographer William Tipton in preparation for Paul Philippotteau's painting of the Gettysburg cyclorama. We're right on a border, so I apologize, but you can see outlined in yellow up there on the right is the Klingel farm. And it does make it into the Gettysburg cyclorama. Now, this is a slightly different angle. I apologize. Like I said, it's not my fault that he put it on the edge of the plate. But here it is, up here at the top of the hill with all of its outbuildings. All right. Beyond that, of course, by 1896, oh, there's the highlight. Forgot I did that. Whoops. By 1896, it's going to be transferred to the War Department. A number of monuments have been placed in the vicinity of the yard of the Klingel house. And we get some good pictures of it through the years. This is taken in 1910. Everybody see what's in the foreground here? The old trolley line. You can also see on the house, it's got board and batten over the top. And that's how it will stay largely through the 20th century. I only wish it had remained that way into the 21st century. Otherwise, we would not be talking about some of the challenges we have. However, in 1955, the National Park Service, after they've taken over the property, going back to 1933, they will open up the farm to tenants. And for a large portion of the 20th century, this farm will be occupied by the Moose family. Now, they are the stewards for the latter part of the 20th century. And when we had that roundtable talk, this is who I had the good fortune of getting to meet, some of the family members, descendants of the Moose family, the stewards of the Klingel farm through the 20th century. It's funny how things work, but pretty cool. We found out they had some photos. As Jim said, I love photos. So here are the Mooses. That's William and Grace, shortly after they became the tenants of the Klingel farmhouse in the late 50s. And of course, their two children. Now, the little girl that you see in the picture has 3 children of her own. She's married to a gentleman named Daniel Sanders. And those 3 kids who grew up in the Klingel house are in this photo. We had a family reunion back in April and collected some of these photos, some of these stories. Some of them don't get to see each other that often, but they were so proud of the fact that their family lineage stretched across the battlefield, not necessarily to the battle itself, but in the role of stewards, caretakers of this property. And the linchpin to all of this is Corey Coulter, who is a local. She's been phenomenal in sharing information with us and providing photos to us like these. They were the harvesters of our peach orchard. This is them in later years. They both died in the early 70s, so this is probably late 60s. But you can see William and Grace here harvesting the peaches. And here they are getting some potatoes. But I love looking through these old photos because these things we often forget. Of course, this is a documentary of the landscape itself. And then, as I stepped into the role of interim Vice President of Development for the Gettysburg Foundation, which I am glad to give back at this point, I had the good fortune of course, asking questions to people about what they knew of the Klingel farm. And as it turns out, there are 2 people that work for our very organization who are married into the Klingel line. And more information came along. So, first of all, one of them here on the right is Carol Weigelman. She is a direct descendant of the gentleman that built the Klingel house in 1828, Ludwig Essek, fourth great-grandfather. And I got to tell you, getting to go into the house and look up to the rafters and see these inscription markings to make sure they've got everything lined up in there, done by her ancestor, was a pretty surreal experience. All right? Now, over here to the left, we have the Grimm family. They're actually very nice people, despite what their name suggests. But they are descendants through Daniel Klingel's brother, John F. Klingel. And it just so happens that they had a little photographic treasure trove of their own. The memorial card for Daniel when he passed away in 1893. A Klingel family reunion in the 1890s at Devil's Den, which I don't care about the battle history, I only care about geology. Those rocks are amazing. So, and then another curious little detail that we unpacked with this collection is in this photo down here to the right. An original cabinet card from the early 20th century. What is that large structure in the background? Anybody know? I think General Reynolds, Moritz Tavern. John F. Klingel and his wife owned the Moritz Tavern in the 20th century. I have not seen a lot of photos of this. And I was very excited to make that connection. Again, they're tightly interwoven. But anyway, that being said, sorry about me being on the left side of the screen. I don't know how to take selfies. I don't have anybody to teach me except my daughter, and they always end up with just her in the picture. So this brings us to today. Through all of these efforts, because of a relationship I had built when I started with the Gettysburg Foundation, through a gentleman named, used to be Chaplain Jamin Bailey of the USS Gettysburg. He now runs the chaplain school up in Connecticut. And his father, as fate would have it, happens to be a master log cabin restoration expert. He's done 56 of them. 56 of them. I have done research high and low and have not found one person who's done more than 9. So when Chaplain Bailey told me this on a phone call, kind of offhandedly, at first it didn't really strike me as anything significant. He's like, my dad works on log cabins. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's great. That's great. Wait, what? What did you say? So his father, Mike, goes by Old Man Bailey. So obviously the photo doesn't give you any clues to eccentricity. But what a fascinating human being, fascinating story. And Mike agreed to use his expertise and come out here to Gettysburg Memorial Day weekend to do a full site inspection and provide design plans to the National Park Service for how we restore the site. This is a major breakthrough for us, the Gettysburg Foundation, the National Park Service, the community who cares about doing what we can to save the integrity, the historic integrity of this site. As you can see, compared to the picture that I first showed at the top of the show, there's a lot more challenges. And in fact, only about 8% of the logs are salvageable. However, this man has more than a half dozen dismantled log cabins of the same size at his property in Indiana. So he's provided to us a full report that now is with the National Park Service, and the hope is that within the coming weeks we'll have a final decision on how we can move forward with taking the structure down, salvaging the material that we can. The flooring, by the way, is immaculate in there, which shocked me. And then rebuilding the structure for the best possible use of interpretation. This is just a schematic of what it would look like. But for those of you that spend a lot of time on the battlefield, and I know many of you do, the Klingel farm sticks out like a sore thumb out there along the Emmitsburg Road. I've said this previously, it's kind of a lighthouse out there. It really is. Whether you're on Seminary Ridge or Cemetery Ridge, it's key to interpreting and orienting oneself to the context of the battle. So, with that being said, to those of you that have been kind enough to support this initiative already, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you sincerely. But we are not there yet. We've got a ways to go. If there is anybody that is interested in supporting this project, there's a QR code up there. Pull your phone out. You can get it if you want. If not, go to gettysburgfoundation.org and find out how you can participate in this story that is the Klingel farm and preserve it for future generations. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to Phil because our story is not done yet. We got to continue moving up the Emmitsburg Road, I think. Yes.
I have no idea how I'm batting cleanup with these two guys. I mean, Andrew just asked me to do certain things at certain times, and then I always say yes. I've yet to do a presentation after 4 or 5 years on the Iron Brigade here or Ohio, which would be easy for me to do. But it also pushes the challenge of learning and research for me when he says, would you like to do an Emmitsburg Road project? And how it started was pretty simple. We got discussing, and you'll learn in a little bit, about the movement of Josephine Rogers, Miller Rogers, Slider eventually, to Ohio. And that's the connection that kind of started this whole thing. I will never leave this house. Josie made that statement to General Carr on July 2nd when he asked her to leave. Consider her the woman in Gettysburg who made bread and cooked for soldiers 3 days and didn't get shot. And I will tell you right now that she stood fire for basically 2 days, every hour of the day. First Massachusetts was the unit that basically was around the Rogers farm more than any other unit, even though the 11th Mass would be in the Emmitsburg Road area and the 26th Pennsylvania would be to their right, all of Carr's brigade. The skirmish line, a lot of times when you talk a Civil War battle, you mention troops being sent to the skirmish line, and then you move on to another phase of the battle. And sometimes the skirmish line might get confused with the picket line, but they're actually two different things that can be the same thing at times. This quote is from a major of the 81st Ohio during the Atlanta campaign, and it describes, I think, in essence, what a skirmish line was. And I won't read you the whole quote. You can kind of read it yourself. The important part is the deeds never were told in Army correspondence nor recorded in official reports, except in such general terms as our skirmish line was advanced or our skirmishers were driven in. The 1st Massachusetts took great pride in having what they considered to be the furthest western Federal regiment during the Battle of Gettysburg, especially the 2nd, 3rd day. And I had to put an Ohio quote in there. I'm sorry. Well, actually, I'm not sorry, but Lieutenant Colonel Clark Baldwin's skirmish line deployment is really interesting because when Carr assigned him the skirmish line, he would move into position around the Rogers farm. And I got to say, the hard part for me is I got to ask you guys to envision the Rogers farm because unlike the Sherfy farm and the Klingel farm, there's no physical presence of it. The sign gets driven by. I would say, by most people on busy Emmitsburg Road. I mean, how many people have taken the time to get out of their car by General Humphrey statue, look both ways, dart across the road, and stand where the Rogers house was? I would venture to say not many. So what Baldwin did is his regiment, 300 and some strong, he would put 9 companies out on the skirmish line 200 or 300 yards to the west of the house. And 6 of the companies would be under the scant cover of a low fence, and the other 5 were like the other companies were put into a wheat field, and it was hot. And this is 11 o'clock noon on July 2nd, and it is a hot day, and they are under fire continuously from Confederate skirmishers that are in the woodlot across the way. The 3 left companies were in a wheat field with little cover, and they were exposed to a hot fire. And he held the color company with the regimental colors were held where the monument is today. The house would be to the south of where the monument is today. He described it as being in a peach orchard. And if you ever stood, again, here we go with that Emmitsburg Road terrain, that is a great spot both to look to the west and to look towards the clump of trees and for Pickett's Charge. It really is a wonderful view shed there. So they were under fire, hot fire, for several hours. And this shows you there's a monument. If you walk on, do a Pickett's Charge walk, I've done a couple with Jim. Normally you'll come by this monument of where the right end of that skirmish line was. The left end would extend to the Spangler farmland. And you kind of get an idea. This would be the left end. Fat old fingers. Right there. Interesting to note is that the 1st Massachusetts was armed with Springfield rifle muskets. The 11th Massachusetts had 69 caliber smoothbores. Now you can see why Baldwin put them on the skirmish line, the guys with the rifle muskets, because that's where the effectiveness of the rifle musket would come into play when you're shooting at individual targets instead of in line of battle. And the 11th would be basically in the Emmitsburg Road area and under the cover of the Rogers farm buildings. Brett already talked about this a little bit, but this is the other end of the Confederate vice of the attack in the afternoon. They caught a little bit at the left flank of Wilcox's advance, but Lang came across the field. The skirmish line fired a couple of volleys. They fell back on their color company reserve and fought for a while in the area of the Rogers farm. The 11th Massachusetts, if you stand where their monument is and you look across the road, you'll see how the terrain rises. And there's some reports from the 11th about how they waited till Lang's guys cleared that terrain, and then they cut loose with those 69 caliber smoothbores with buck and ball. It's pretty good tactical deployment by their commander. This is Corporal Nathan Allen, Company B. When his regiment was falling back, this soldier bearing the national color returned in the face of the company's fire and pulled the regimental flag from under the body of its bearer who had fallen, saved that flag from capture, and brought both colors off the field. Promoted to corporal on January 26, 1863, he served till he was honorably mustered out in 64. He's buried in Massachusetts and was given the Medal of Honor in, like so many of these veterans in the 1890s, for his actions. Barely a year before he would pass away. I got to say, I'm going to back up maybe a Sherfy farm story real quick. A coincidence, those of you who have read these guys' fine books, there's some mentions of the color bearers, the 2 color bearers of the 114th Pennsylvania. They're both buried within rows of each other at the Dayton National Cemetery in Dayton. And it's close to our house, and I always envision these guys, as they were in the soldiers' home, how many times they would talk, usually in the beer hall, because a lot of times when you read about the veterans' stories, that's when they really would talk to each other about their experiences on Emmitsburg Road. This is one of the officers who fell. He's buried in the National Cemetery. He was killed on the skirmish line. Captain, had enlisted as a sergeant, and again, he is buried in the National Cemetery. First buried on the Nicholas Kadori farm. The first Massachusetts losses. Now remember, this was mostly skirmish line fighting, okay? 321 engaged, 16 killed, 83 wounded, 21 missing, 37%. That's pretty heavy casualties for skirmish line fighting. This is the famous Harvest of Death photo that we can talk about where the location is. My old friend Jerry Coates, many of you might recognize that name from the Friends. He had an article in one of the early issues of Gettysburg magazine where he thought these were New Jersey troops out west of Emmitsburg Road. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll say they were New Jersey troops. So, to the farm, to the Rogers farm. Peter and Susan Kitzmiller Rogers owned a farm, very small, one-story log, white farmhouse. We really don't have any good images of it. They would die respectively in 1876 and 1882 and would be buried in Evergreen Cemetery. But they had a daughter. And this is, much to my wife's chagrin, my new Gettysburg girlfriend. I would prefer you refer to her as Josie from now on instead of Josephine, because that's what the veterans called her. I think she's pretty attractive. She's got great eyes, personally. She was the granddaughter of Susan and was adopted by Peter and Susan, her grandfather. I talked to Tim Smith again today, and Tim has yet to figure out the Miller, Rogers, Josephine family tree yet. It is, there's a story there someplace, and if anybody is going to uncover it, well, you know Tim will. She absolutely refused to leave the house. She stayed and cooked and made bread for the soldiers of the 1st 11th Massachusetts, even to the point that some of the soldiers of the 1st Mass had went and raided General Sickles' commissary and bought back like dates and figs. They bought back a whole sheep. They bought, in the afternoon, we're talking on July 2nd, these guys are bringing this woman a whole sheep to cook. I don't think the pot was that big. I don't know. You know, I read this account, I'm just going, a sheep? You know. So, anyhow, but she cooked throughout the day. The house, after the battle, was a complete, the descriptions that these guys already talked about are exactly the same. Torn bedding, blood-soaked, 17 dead soldiers around it, dead Confederate soldier on the roof, torn up, you know. Well, I don't need to go on with any more descriptions. But she would marry William Slider. Name sound familiar? Slider Farm. Another torn up Gettysburg devastated property. Okay, now you can imagine, and anybody who ever has read Greg Coco's fine book, which is really all you have to read on the aftermath of the battle, the battlefield area was just horrible. They would move to Ohio in October 1863, and not just William and Josephine, but the whole Slider family. John Slider owned the farm. They would all pack up and move to Ohio, which is good. It's good. It's good. First Mansfield, Ohio, then eventually near Dayton, a little town called Joestown, which is a suburb of Dayton now, and then they would end up in Troy, Ohio. She suffered from rheumatism the last 10, 15 years of her life, severe rheumatism the last 10, 15 years of her life. There's the best picture of the Slider farm we have. Obviously, that's the Klingel farm. Actually, it looks pretty good in that, doesn't break compared to what it looks now. The terrain is so interesting to me, and this is mainly because of these two guys' book talking about the terrain and Emmitsburg Road Ridge. The reverse side of the slope of the Klingel farm gave protection to the troops of Carr's brigade during, it really is. You drive around and study the terrain, you can really understand that part of the action. It drives the battle. I know you all heard that before. But after the second, as Brett said, it wasn't over for them. She was still in the house. And look where the Confederate artillery positions are around the house. Okay, well, and we all know where the Federal artillery positions are going to be because there they are. This is a picture I took yesterday. Cooper's Battery, 3-inch ordnance rifle. That's where the headquarters were of the 1st Mass, and the house is obviously right over here. Oops, another fat finger motion. Also, I would have to say that is, and Jim, you can correct me, is that not the largest 3rd Corps badge on the field? Could be. Yeah, I was going to say, that's, Never thought of it. Yeah, it is. Well, you can use that if you want to. Maybe I'll get a book. It is. Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. Okay. The fighting at the farm was yet over because, interesting enough, the next year, a painful occurrence occurred. A young man named Henry Terrell of Emmitsburg, who has been in the service. Now, I searched the service records. I could not find where this guy served. That makes no difference. And lately discharged, was on his way to Gettysburg to join the celebration there. And this was November, I believe. Obviously, the address in the cemetery. In passing the house of Mr. Peter Rogers, about 1.5 miles south of town, he saw some flowers. And he wanted those flowers, and he requested a few, and Mr. Rogers said no. And Terrell went in the yard and took them anyhow. The result was they spoke high words. I bet they did. Between the parties, and Rogers seized an axe and followed him out. Well, then Terrell then fired. He had a revolver. You never take an axe to a fight with a guy with a revolver. I don't care about these axe throwing places and stuff now. You're not going to win. So Rogers was shot in the abdomen and had a very serious wound. He would survive. Terrell would end up going to jail, going to prison. And, a fight, a flower-fueled firefight. Say that 3 times fast. The Baker of Gettysburg. So we know Josephine, the whole Slider clan, has moved to Ohio. Ohio, where the corn is high and the women are beautiful, But she got invited. Now, there's a couple different stories. Invited back to the monument dedication to the reunion. And one story says that she was invited by the reunion committee, so obviously, they would know she's coming. Another story says it was a secret, and people in the crowd were whispering, "Who is that lady on the podium? We don't recognize her." And then she was introduced as Mrs. Slider, Josie, and the crowd went wild. These veterans went wild because this was the woman who had baked bread and sheep and other things for them. And they gave her a gold badge, with a Corps badge, a gold reunion badge for her efforts. And this is a photo of her with the stove. Now, the other part of the story is when they met her and saw her, they went into the old smokehouse or the house, and they found the stove. The stove was still there that she had baked the bread on. They brought it out, and they fired it up, and she made bread. And then another reunion, she had come back and actually cooked for General Sickles. Maybe he finally got his sheep back. I never really thought about that part. This is a picture of her at the reunion, obviously. And Baldwin and Carr are with her, and the veterans of the 1st Massachusetts at the monument dedication. It's a beautiful monument, and you can learn a lot by the monuments. And I know the battlefield guides here will tell you that the corps badges themselves and the position of the monuments will tell a whole story of the battle. But I had to do some monument pictures because this one is really good. Obviously, the firearm is correct. It's a Springfield. The accoutrements are worn correctly. The canteen is worn tight up against the body. This is another picture of the other area. You can see them leaning against the fence out on the skirmish line. Soldier has taken off his blanket roll. It lies at his feet. Other interesting details on this side, there's smoke. Is that artillery, Confederate artillery? Is that Confederate skirmish fire? The rest of the monument doesn't have that sort of design on it. Get an opportunity, go study the monument. It will tell you a story. And the back side of the monument, where she was standing, obviously tells the position of the support and the skirmish line and their casualties. She lived in 1911 in Troy. She's buried close to where I live, hence this story. Gettysburg, or Gettysburg, is wherever you can find it. In every community, you can find a Gettysburg story, if it's there. Even in Ohio, you can find Gettysburg stories. And the death was caused by rheumatism, 74 years old, and there tells her story about her, the heroine of the battlefield. Wouldn't leave the house, carried water, took care of the wounded soldiers. She became covered with blood. The soldiers knew her and revered her as one of the bravest women at the battle, and talks about getting her story. She had 3 children. Rose O'Connor, Rose Slider, and Melvin would actually live till 1961 and 1962. Okay? So obviously I was alive then. It's pretty cool to think that connection. Ida would die in 1910, and William James Slider, her husband, would follow Josephine across the river in May of 1911, shortly after she died in January. This is her grave in a Riverside Cemetery. Josephine stone with the flag. Wayne did a video this last October on her up there, and it's a good story. It's a good battlefield story. But she wouldn't leave that damn house. She stayed the whole time, you know. And the soldiers never forgot Josie Rogers. And that's all I have.
Do we have any questions? Melissa, hand up.
When the claims are denied for these families, what does the government say? Why do they deny them?
From what I've seen, basically they don't give much of a reason. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that with the claims, it's who caused the damage.
That's what I was going to say, right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. No, go ahead. Go ahead. That's fine. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, when you make a claim against the federal government, federal troops have to have caused the damage. The Mumma House, or Mumma House, however you pronounce it, up at the Antietam battlefield, was burned by the Confederates. The Mumma family filed a claim. The federal government said, our troops did not cause the damage to your house. But in some cases here, you had with Chamberlain, for example, doing damage, and they specified the amount of the claim that was for that damage to the fence.
You're exactly correct.
Right.
So I don't know why in that case they didn't pay $100.
Yeah, it's not a perfect science. I would add to that because we do have proof for both the Klingel and the Sherfy house that there are union actions involved in causing the damage, and then for whatever reason they don't award anything. So I don't think it's a perfect science. It might be who you know.
Could be.
Well, it's all the paperwork, and
Yep.
look at 1883. I mean, it's denied then. The Rogers families filed a claim that was a little bit under $200. I don't know whether it was awarded. I have an ancestor that lived near Winchester, Virginia, and William Fonstock, and his land was really torn up. I mean, and he never got a penny. So I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the short answer, and I know you probably know this, the short answer being you had to prove which side caused the damage, but as one of these guys said, clearly it's not an imperfect science. Dana, I think you've got something you want to add?
No, I don't. I had a question.
Oh, different. Okay, different question.
So the Elliott map was obviously very valuable to all of you, and we know there's one for Antietam. I've never really been clear who Elliott was, why he did these maps, and when did he do them to act. So how confident we are that those grave locations are accurate.
I'll start. Yeah, my recollection on Elliott is he's from Philadelphia. He's doing this for commercial purposes, as I recall, basically, like people have been doing from July of 1863 to July 2nd of 2025, taking advantage of Gettysburg a little bit. But my recollection, Dana, is he's doing it for commercial purposes. When he's coming here in the fall of 63 and doing this, as you know, many of the graves at that point have already been started to have been exhumed from the battlefield into the Soldiers' National Cemetery. So particularly, I think, in terms of Union graves, my understanding is Elliott he's going based on what he sees, but at the same time, he's also talking to farmers too. He's talking to people. What did you have on your property and things of that nature. What I personally always tell people with Elliott is, look, we can't really vouch for the numbers. I always tell people don't focus as much on the numbers, but focus more on the concentrations. 500 might be not the right number here, but look at the concentration. And that's usually what I tell people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, specifically when it comes to known hospitals on that map, if you look across the map, you can at least verify locations of some of these cemeteries with corroborating evidence, whether the numbers are accurate or not. In some cases, they're close. There are a couple hospital sites that are close based on other evidence we have, but it's more geographic location of these grave sites, I think.
It's interesting to me that the Antietam map has more identified sites
Yeah.
than the Gettysburg map does. I don't know. I mean, you would think, obviously, Antietam being in September of 62, a longer time before Elliott got on the field, I would think, but you're right. It's a great resource. It's a great guide, but at that point.
Up to a point, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
6.
What happened to the Rogers farm? Why is it no longer there?
It survived until the 1880s. They tore it down. Another house was built, and eventually that house, too, was torn down.
I was
And,
disappointed you did not mention whose headquarters used the Rogers site in 1913, since you took a few shots at our favorite Third Corps general.
I mentioned
thought you
the
were gonna
big.
get out
Hey,
of it,
wait a
Phil.
minute. No, I
You
mentioned.
thought
the
you
bi-
escaped.
I mentioned the big. I know. I know. There's always this one thing. No, I mentioned the big Corps badge,
Well, you did.
and I mentioned she cooked a sheep for him.
You did mention that.
Okay, and I got those things right. Okay, so was he on the porch? Is that the Roger, or is that
Yeah.
the Klingel house? He was
It's
on the porch.
Rogers.
Oh,
when,
okay.
So when y'all see those picked photos of Sickles at the 50th anniversary, 1913, on the porch with the veterans, in some of the images you will see the sign that says, "Here stood the Rogers house." So again, it's not the original, but it's the site. So presumably that second one.
And I will throw out there, now you can see it with generative AI in motion, as I saw online last week, which is pretty cool. Sickles is moving. Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And he was everywhere.
Yeah.
Sherfy all the way down to Rogers. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's impressive. Just one leg. Wow.
For Phil, did Josie's grandparents stay in the house, or did
Her grandmother, a couple accounts left. Her grandfather stayed with her by most accounts. There's one account that he did leave too. They eventually ended up in the basement for a while, and then came up the cellar, obviously not the basement, and it came up so she can continue her cooking and first aid for the soldiers.
Henry Blake, his 11th Massachusetts memoir. I think it's
Yeah.
3 years in the Army of the Potomac. He's not terribly flattering of the Rogers. Now, if anybody ever read Henry Blake's memoirs, he's not terribly flattering of anybody. I think is sort of a typical New England masshole, sarcastic.
Man, you know what?
But
I was going to say that, and you stole that from me again.
But I just, if you had any thoughts, no,
I
on
read
his
it.
opinion
You can
of the
get
Rogers.
his Google Books. You can get it on Google Books. It's a great memoir. But
great read.
I don't know whether because maybe the first mass got the lion's shares of the attention there. Their monument, I just saw it today. At the bottom says "All's well that ends well." At the bottom. And I guess that means we won, but but yeah, so no, he's not, but he's pretty caustic anyhow. Yeah, he's,
It's a fun read if you've never read it.
yeah,
regardless
download
of
it.
accurate.
Yeah, it's good, man. It's good. And the Little Pfeiffer's good too, or Piper. Have you read that? The First Mass, little guy wrote the book. Any other questions?
Actually, I have a question about the Wentz house wasn't mentioned, even though that was in that strip there. Is that because we don't know that much about it, or did it didn't really factor in much in the fighting that day?
I think we just chose not to cover it. If we had a fourth friend, he or she could have done well.
Yeah,
Next year, if you're willing to come on board.
But to that point, yes, very important location. Troops were in the Wentz house as well. Sharpshooters from the 2nd New Hampshire were very much on the property. So yeah, important property. We should not have neglected Wentz. Of course, you have the Henry Wentz human interest story, but yeah, like I said, we just didn't know enough people to keep this thing going.
Where do we stop? I mean, we left the Cadoris out.
We didn't do Spangler.
We didn't do Spangler,
Kadori.
Cador.
Yeah.
We're probably going to get emails and stuff
Yeah.
from families.
Volume 2, July 2nd,
Exactly.
2026,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I think that guy back there's been waiting.
Are you guys going to do any anthropological digs at the Klingel farm when you are rebuilding it, or are you trying to do it well?
So not intentionally. So anytime work is done on National Park Service property, of course, the park archaeologist and his team will go out to do a site survey. Depending on the nature of the dismantling of the home for the rebuild purposes, there may be some of that work that occurs. But as much as possible, the Park Service tries to avoid that for a number of different reasons. It's interesting. I spent some time with a gentleman yesterday who was asking the same question about, hey, this battlefield must be picked over. There's probably not much to discover out there on the landscape. And the truth is, the Gettysburg battlefield has really not seen a lot of archaeological work. Outside of people picking up artifacts in the aftermath of the battle, and because of accidental discovery or moving structures, be they trails or other resources, there has not really been a lot of work done here. So we'll see is the answer.
There's one account that I didn't mention on the Rogers farm actually it was after the war. A correspondent had visited Gettysburg, and he stopped at the Rogers farm and wanted to know if Josie was home, but she had already left for Ohio. And the kid who was there, whether it's another grandchild or whatever, was telling how his grandfather had picked up and was selling a lot of lead off of the battlefield. And that's something after the war was really prevalent, especially in the southern states, Virginia. The sale of scrap lead was a way to, make a little coin.
That's also why we have questions about what type of peach trees were there, because people are ripping limbs off the trees to make canes and gavels and leave it to humans. Anyway.
There's one back there.
So during the battle, was the Klingel farm, did it look like a log cabin and it wasn't painted white?
Yeah, as far as we know, the structure that exists in 1863 was that log appearance. The images, most of the ones that I showed you were early 20th century, late 19th century, but the board and batten had already been added, and it existed that way through the 20th century. However, in 1863, it was just a log facade.
We got room for one more.
Major.
Did General Sickles ever visit the Sherfy house on any of his return trips?
Fascinating question. You know, interestingly enough, off the top of my head, I do not recall any specific account. We must assume he did, but I don't recall any specific account of him doing it. I'm sure he did. I just can't think of one. Can you think of one?
For this, well, for the sake of clarity, you mean while he was alive? Okay, because he's been back many times.
He wanted that
since.
sheep.
Whether it's a cardboard cutout.
She had
or-
such
Yeah.
beautiful.
I was wondering.
I know.
I was wondering where you were going with that.
Yeah, I've been there.
I actually didn't know either. I'm glad something came to my mind, but yeah.
She had such beautiful blue eyes.
Yeah. And we've learned today Phil looks at a girl's eyes. Sure does.
Okay, who doesn't?
The just one thing I would add on that real quick is you're right. You know, all the newspaper accounts have seen a Sickles at this reunion or that reunion. I can't recall ever seeing him at Sherfy. I'm sure he did, but we do know a lot of his veterans did as well, and that was part of the reunion story too.
Yeah, without having a material that says Sickles was here on this date, in all of those veterans reunion sources that we found, he's spending time with all the units that were at the Peach Orchard when he comes back. Yeah. And many of them talk about spending time at the Sherfy house or on the ground. So likely, yes, but we don't know for sure.
Good question. Okay, I think that was the last one. Hey, once again, just want to thank all of you.